here's Brody Brazil.
So I recently made a video predicting 5 things for the NHL that I didn't necessarily like or agree with. One of them involved expansion, but not just that, specifically expansion to Atlanta for a third different time in the history of the National Hockey League. Now again, to separate here, 2 things going on. I'm not personally sure about expansion right now for the NHL as a business, considering the bigger picture and everything else going on. But I'm also not convinced, or at least I wasn't convinced, about the NHL going back to a city for a third time where it's already struggled to succeed on 2 different occasions. And so I actually got a comment here from Will P 8120. And normally when it's not a name or there's no photo, it seems rather anonymous. Comments and stuff on social media, I kind of brush past a lot of this. But Will P said, Brody, here are the facts on Atlanta, and then continued to give me like a dozen different points, and some people said TLDR, too long, didn't read. But I actually went through it because Will P 8120 had some fascinating things to say, going against my opinion that Atlanta may not be the greatest idea in expansion for a third time. And I basically said, hey, prove it to me. Like, you're going to have to prove this to me that it's actually a good idea. What's changed? What's different? Well, Will P 8120 has that for us in just a second. But first, it's important you understand some facts on the NHL and the ATL. The Flames were there from 1972 to 1980. They're obviously now the Calgary Flames. But during their time in Georgia, they made the playoffs in 6 of their 8 seasons of existence. So at least in terms of a product that was exciting, that was successful, yeah, you could largely say they got that job done. Then the Thrashers came around. They were approved, I think, in 1997. They debuted in 1999, and they exited Atlanta in 2011. They only had 1 playoff season of 2006-2007, and they were eliminated in the first round. Atlanta right now is the only city to receive and lose 2 different NHL teams. And by the way, just in terms of hockey, since 2003, so like simultaneously for a while when the Thrashers were still there, they've hosted the ECHL's Gladiators for, going on, 20 plus years now, 21 seasons. So I credit them for that. It's kind of interesting. We're talking about ECHL teams and an NHL team going back to this market. That doesn't always happen like that. Okay, here are some of the Will P things that were said that I want to respond to. Number 1, Atlanta is the 6th most populated metropolitan area by population in the USA as of 2024. It has passed Miami, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. within the past 3 years. Look, I'm not debating size or continued growth at all. Atlanta's a big market. And I do think we can all agree the NHL works best in 2 different scenarios, one of 2 different scenarios. Either a huge market like obviously New York, where you can even have the Devils, the Rangers, and the Islanders, the New York like general metropolitan area, and in fact the state of New York, you've got the Buffalo Sabres. So that's kind of a hockey-friendly market and region, but you either need a big city. I mean, I think Dallas goes along. It's just a big city. But it also obviously works in specialty markets as well. Edmonton, Calgary, they're not the biggest cities in North America, but they are very hockey specific. So you need a specialty market or you need a big market. Obviously, Atlanta satisfies the big market. Atlanta is the 6th largest media market in the USA. So separately from population, we're talking about just like a media rights deal. Yeah, that's going to be important for the team to have a local network, a local broadcaster, how the majority of people in Atlanta and the entire state of Georgia can view the actual games. It's also a big revenue producing part of a franchise. You get money for selling off your media rights. But it's also not the only source of business and revenue. And I know Will wasn't saying, well, this is the only reason, but this is one of many convincing reasons. So yes, in the overall scheme of things, it's not all the way up there. It's not nothing. This one right there is probably somewhere in the middle. Atlanta has the 8th highest GDP, gross domestic product, among metropolitan areas in the United States. Well, didn't we just say they were the, 6th, 7th, or 8th largest population market? So yeah, GDP is proportionate to market size in the United States. And GDP obviously is a good indicator of how the local economy is performing. People are doing well. They're willing to spend money. It's an expensive proposition to take your family out to a hockey game. At least a couple $100 for tickets, food, merchandise, parking, etc. And by the way, I did some research just to confirm this was actually correct. If you look at the GDP of the Atlanta metropolitan region, it is growing rapidly. Like it's doubled, I want to say, in the last 10, 12 years alone. So that's actually a fairly relevant point. Point number 4 here. Atlanta has a huge corporate presence. Coca-Cola, UPS, Home Depot, Southern Company, Georgia Pacific, etc. I agree, Will P. Now, you would need to assure that you could make these partnerships, you could benefit from these partnerships. Just because they exist doesn't mean they're going to sponsor or largely benefit your professional sports team. There's competition, right? There's a football team, a basketball team, a baseball team in Atlanta. So you need to make sure you can have them on board with you, but it obviously provides a tremendous corporate benefit when you talk about sponsorships, partnerships, and also the amount of tickets you could sell to these companies. They love to treat their employees. So as long as you capitalize on some of this, yes, I think that's medium to high grade relevance here in the overall situation. Number 5, Atlanta in terms of media network presence is third behind New York and Los Angeles. It's home to CNN, the Weather Channel, Cartoon Network, TBS, TNT, Boomerang, and TCM. So I don't know how to put this, but unless this Atlanta hockey team's games are going to be televised on the Cartoon Network or the Weather Channel, I mean, it's a nice part of the local economy and identity. And I know they do a lot of film production, actually, in the state of Georgia. It's become a booming area for movie makers and stuff, but it's insignificant here. Like, again, I know that's part of the growth. It's part of the identity, but it doesn't make a difference whether those channels have their studios there or on the moon. It really doesn't. Number 6, Atlanta is currently is home of the Hockey Night coverage on TNT. The studios pre and post game are from Atlanta. That's also true, and I love Liam and Biz and all the guys on the panel there. The great one, sometimes, that's true, but it's also insignificant to the NHL. That studio, that production could be anywhere. It just so happens that's where Turner is located, to your point earlier. It doesn't really matter. That's not going to benefit an Atlanta NHL franchise 3.0. Point number 7 here, Atlanta has grown almost 1.5 million people since the Thrashers left town in 2011. The population is now at 6.4 million people. And look, I agree, we're 13 years removed since the last NHL season in Atlanta. So I do want to look at things and say, well, what has changed? This has definitely changed here. A population growth, an increase in people. Now, it's not to say all of them are hockey fans, not nearly. But if you're talking 5, 10, 15, 20,000 out of these 6.4 million people that grew and expanded in the last 13 years, then yeah, I would say that's a positive change. You still need proof that there's an interest level here among a potential fan base, that they'll support the team through thick and thin. And I don't know how expansion's going to go. Again, the entire expansion conversation is separate from is Atlanta good or not for expansion. But what if it works out like a Seattle or a Vegas thing where your team gets to poach 37 other NHL players? You might be a good team out of the gate, and largely we know that first impression is great among an expanded fan base. Okay, number 8, Atlanta never lost its teams on account of fan support. Both were on account of ownership mishaps. And I don't disagree. There were some sales, transactions, questions among front offices and ownerships with both the Flames and the Thrashers. But just looking at the Thrashers alone, I feel like to go back on the Flames, now we're several decades ago, things were different. I can't completely comprehend that, but I can comprehend the Thrashers here. In their first season, they had a 92.7% attendance rate in terms of total fans versus what was it, Phillips Arena? It's now called something else. What Phillips Arena used to hold, it's where the Hawks play. 92% was their first and best season, attendance-wise, 92.7%. Their final season, obviously, was their worst at 72.6%. It fluctuated back and forth. It was never higher than 90. It was never lower than 72, 92 and 72. But it was usually 80-something, 90-something, 70-something. But what's kind of interesting here, if you transposed their best season, their first season, 92.7%, and you put it in NHL attendance today, in 2024, they would rank 28th out of 32 teams. So that's not enough. Their best season back then was not enough. Now, attendance, fan support versus ownership mishaps and things that fans will disagree with, I understand. It takes two to tango. You've got to have a well-run, well-oiled team for fans to fully show up. But I'm also saying that because of one or the other, like the end result is who shows up and who doesn't, again, largely dictated on what the ownership does. In this case, over all the years, the ownership had some superstars, didn't always spend up to the cap. In fact, here's a great point. 06-07, the year that they went to the playoffs, that was their highest percentage of cap space used, 85.4% of the cap. So this was never a franchise that spent all the way up to the top of the cap, got the right players, had the horses to make playoff runs. It was kind of a middle-of-the-road or less type franchise, and because of that, it was reflected in attendance. So look, not blaming the fans here. I want to make that extremely clear. But if we're going back to the gauge of fan support, it wasn't always there, probably because, to your point, Will P., of the way that the franchise was run. Point number 9, Atlanta bested the Chicago Blackhawks in attendance 11 out of 19 NHL seasons and original 6 team. So we're including the Flames years and the Thrashers years here to get to those 19 seasons. One of the big problems is that the Thrashers barely edged Chicago a couple years in the early 2000s. It was hard times for Chicago hockey fans. So a few times that happened with the Thrashers. But then when Chicago came back and got good again, they out-averaged the Thrashers in those final couple years by like 7,000 fans or more. So it wasn't even close. And I realize you're putting Atlanta up against an original 6, kind of a marquee hockey market. This is Chicago. I get it. And that's a good point, but it's a little bit misleading. It's really apples and oranges to try and do that comparison. Point number 10, Atlanta has an arena that is set to begin construction in September. It has a potential owner who owns the land on which it is set to be constructed. The land has been cleared and is currently being graded. The county has agreed to pay upwards of 40% of costs of the arena. It's already been given approval. A new freeway exit is being constructed right near the new arena site. I did some research on that, Will P., and the renderings look great. The project, it's kind of out in the suburbs. Totally understand what they're doing. I'm not going to disagree with you here. This part makes it a lot easier on the NHL. Whether it's a good idea or not to still go into this market, will they have the support or not, doesn't matter. But in terms of having a place to land, a place to call home, this is usually one of the headaches of the NHL. If they really want to go to a certain market and they really want to get in there, but there's going to be trouble with the building. There's going to be trouble with the situation of how this all comes together. There's clearly not that. So this paves the road, makes it a lot more smooth into Atlanta. Point number 11, Atlanta has great sports attendance in all of its other sports. Atlanta United, by the way, that's a great example of the MLS, is first in attendance and has always been first in attendance since they entered the league 7 years ago. The Atlanta Braves of Major League Baseball, not the MLB, just MLB. Sorry, pet peeve, was fifth in attendance of 30 teams last year, and it probably would have been second if the stadium were as large as those that were second, third, and fourth. Yeah, Dodger Stadium is huge. It's hard to compete with that. The Falcons finished in the top half of attendance, even with multiple years in a row with losing records. The Hawks are over 99% capacity in attendance, which again, if you're the Thrashers or whatever's next in Atlanta, you can't be at 92% attendance. You've got to be better than that. So all of this, though, I'll say it again, is apples and oranges. Baseball has been there for a long time. Soccer's new. Soccer's kind of universal, but you're right. Soccer has worked out well. Do you know for sure that it would happen this way and translate entirely into the NHL? I'd like to believe that, but I don't know that that right there is a direct comparison. It's something interesting, but what's the relationship? Point number 12 here, this might be the last one. Atlanta is far larger than other cities that do well in the NHL in the same region. Atlanta is over 3 times the size of Nashville. It has more northern transplants than Nashville. Atlanta also outsold Nashville 6 out of the 11 seasons that the Thrashers were in Atlanta. Atlanta is over 3 times the size of Raleigh-Durham, and they had the second highest attendance last year. Atlanta is over double the size of Tampa Bay, who had the third best attendance last year. But again, it's hard to gauge all of that. Nashville, a good or bad hockey team. The Canes, a good or bad hockey team. the Bolts a good or bad hockey team? Yeah, in the Sun Belt, like success kind of dictates attendance. And it does generally speaking across the board, but maybe that's more magnified to those markets which you mention in those southern part of the continent cities. Atlanta was relatively populated in the 2000s, though, also, like when the Thrashers were first there, or even when the Flames existed several decades ago. So we can talk about attendance and this versus that. Again, the apples and oranges thing, it's really hard to make direct comparisons and say, well, it worked there, but yes, sometimes it takes special things for it to work there that maybe will or will not translate in Atlanta. Oh, I lied. There's one more. Point number 13, Atlanta held a Thrashers Night last week, and they had an easy sellout despite the team having the worst record in the ECHL. That's the Gladiators game. But even if you look at their attendance, and again, this is ECHL hockey, I think they play in a rink that seats like 13 or 14,000, and they draw, I think, 6,000 or 7,000 on average. But that is, again, apples and oranges, right? If you bring in NHL hockey to a brand new building, that type of excitement. Of course, I'm just saying, even with the minor league team, they're not selling the barn out on a regular basis or not even close. So that kind of goes against the conversation here. But the enthusiasm for that night, Thrashers Night, the fan base, again, don't want to take this away from potential hockey fans in Atlanta. That's noted. And that's a big deal. To have a base, you can't start any of this conversation without a base. And it does seem like that already exists in Atlanta. But the biggest takeaway, and I'm leaving it here for last, it kind of doesn't matter about the fans and population. And yeah, business and sponsorship in the arena do matter. You need a competent team, a competent owner, and you need dedication by the NHL to say, we will go back here. We will make this work for you. We're not going to bend the rules or anything, but we're going to find ways to help you out in this endeavor. So this is not a problem. Again, we're not moving you out of here for a third time. Look at recent examples of Las Vegas and Seattle. It seems like those franchises are built to last. So the question is, well, twofold. Number one, is expansion a great idea for the NHL? You got to convince me on that. And it's the whole 32 versus 33, 34, 35. You got to go to 36 to get 9, 9, 9, and 9 across the divisions. And you're diluting the NHL. It's too complicated. No other pro sports league in North America has that many teams. And I don't know that the NHL should either. But again, just the expansion part with Atlanta. I really appreciate the commentary by Will P. So it just goes to show you, if you put something smart in the comments, I'm definitely going to read it. I might even make a response video just like this. So I told Will I would do this, and I appreciate that kind of back and forth. That educated back and forth. Let's really have a conversation. And if you have some follow-ups to this, yeah, put them down in the comments and we'll see where it goes. But for now, you've made it here to the end of the video. I really appreciate that. Thumbs up down below. Also, don't forget, subscribe to the channel. I mean, if you're just seeing me and all of this for the very first time, I appreciate it. I'm glad you found me. But make sure you subscribe so I can definitely see you back here next time.